将在上海举办首届中国国际进口博览会。
On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, 100 days until the first ever China International Import Expo, can it showcase that China will lead the charge of open trade? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Shanghai is preparing for the 100-day countdown to the China International Import Expo. Organizers continue to sign up local importers, and foreign exporters are lining up as well to get in as exhibitors.
The China International Import Expo is scheduled for November 5th to 10th in Shanghai. And this Friday begins the 100-day countdown. So far, more than 1,000 local companies have said they are interested in going shopping at the CIIE, and they've got a combined budget of 4 billion yuan. The shopping appetite from local companies is strong, and international companies are also lining up, keen on getting into the Chinese market. Mount Fuji Springs is a Japanese company that sells mountain spring and water dispensers, and is one of the latest batch of foreign companies to sign up.
Many Chinese households have water dispensers, but they don't know much about the healthier and safer dispensers. We hope to enter the Chinese market with our high-end dispensers, and we plan to make the Chinese sales account for 10 to 20% of our total sales. We are cooperating with Chinese companies not only to bring products, but also to promote our lifestyle.
Mount Fuji Springs has signed an MOU with local service provider Orient International, one of the government-tasked service providers to help importers with their preparations for the expo. Some foreign companies are even looking at a long-term presence in China.
We're signing MOUs today with companies attending the Import Expo. We provide them with all kinds of services, including information about sales channels in China, logistics, and travel and accommodation services. Also, some companies have already booked a seat for the expo next year.
Wang says that apart from the 6-day expo, the organizer is also providing exhibitors with online platforms to showcase their products. These platforms will serve as a bridge between local purchasing companies and international sellers for the coming year. So far, Orient International has received more than 7,000 local companies' applications to register on the platform.
For more on how the China International Import Expo will affect the China-U.S. trade, we are joined in our Beijing studio by Zhang Gong, professor from the University of International Business and Economics here in Beijing, and in Washington, D.C., Jeff Moon, former assistant U.S. trade representative for China. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. I want to start with you, of course, Professor Gong. Tell us about this grand plan of import expo from China.
Well, this is the first time in world history, I guess, that to have a import expo for China, also for the world for that matter. I don't see any other countries would hold a import expo to increase imports. I think it's purely because China is the world's largest trading nation. We have such a big trading volume, and in particular, our exports exceeds our imports by a large margin. And as a responsible nation in the world, I think we have this problem to reduce deficits, particularly reduce deficits with respect to reduce surpluses, especially with respect to the United States. It's for that reason that I think we are having this grand imports exhibition.
Okay. Mr. Moon, how do you interpret an import expo alone from China? Do you have that from the United States?
Well, we have a Select USA event that talks about investment into the United States, but I don't think we have such a expo like you're talking about. But I see this as a very positive signal. This is Xi Jinping and the rest of his government signaling that China wants to increase imports. That's a very important signal in the context of the current trade dispute. The question is whether that is a political statement or it will be backed up by economic events that will actually encourage exports. And I certainly hope that that happens. And if that were the case, that would help the U.S.-China trade relationship.
But whether or not there is an import expo from China, Mr. Moon, I have to remind you whether it's going to change fundamentally for your own economic structure and therefore reduce the deficit that the U.S. is having against all major economies around the world is not necessarily an answer that China could give, is it, Mr. Moon?
Well, one event won't take care of the problem, but it is a step towards something. And that's why I was saying I hope that since this is the first event, I hope that the leadership will use this as a venue to make important announcements about reform and opening up and restoring equality and mutual benefit to the trade relationship. Yeah. The expo could also be used to increase transparency. If Ministry of Commerce officials were to take the opportunity to explain Chinese import regulations and rules to people from foreign countries.
Okay.
These are concrete steps that the government could take.
Without addressing the structural problem or the issue of the United States, your own economy, whether China is having an import expo or the EU is having an import expo is not going to help you to reduce your deficit with the other major economies around the world, Mr. Moon. That is the question.
Well, this expo deals with China only. We have other activities ongoing with other countries as well. As you know, within the past day, there have been discussions with the Europeans, for example.
Yes.
So one event, one country won't change everything, but this is a global activity.
All right, interesting. Mr. Moon seems to suggest, Professor Gong, that all the others need to take a step back and therefore the U.S. will benefit and therefore reduce its deficit with the rest of the world. I want you to address that, and also how do you frame that with the context of this expo? Import expo.
I don't understand that. Yeah, I think one of the primary purpose of having an import exposition is to really help small and medium-sized businesses around the world, particularly in the United States, to increase exports to China. Usually big companies, they have their own sales channels. They probably have a representative office here in China already. And as a matter of fact, they probably have operations here in China already. So I think there are still a lot of very good small and medium-sized business in some inland states, for example, in the state of Texas, in state of Oklahoma. These small and medium-sized business usually have an entry barrier. There's a very high fixed cost of entering an international market. And by holding an exposition like this, it greatly helps those medium, small-sized business to finding business opportunities, finding marketing and sales channels in China.
Okay. Is it for U.S. alone, Mr. Gong?
No,
you have to mention it very clearly because it sounds like your answer is about this is for you in the United States.
Yeah, I'm more perplexed with the issue, trade surplus problem with the United States. Of course, China maintains trade surplus with several countries, but by far the largest trade surplus and also the most prominent issue here in terms of international relations context is definitely with the United States.
But my question to you is, can this import expo come from China or whatever the other expos, if there are any coming from the other economies, will be able to address fundamentally the U.S. issue of so-called having deficit with the other major economies?
No. It's not going to solve
Why
U.S.
not?
trade
Could you
problem.
explain?
The fundamental problem is that the United States, as we know it, as an economics profession, we call it a twin deficit problem. It has a fiscal deficit as well as a trade deficit. And a condition that the United States is also issuing a currency that is actually used worldwide, it's very easy for the United States to run into trade deficits with many, many countries. So I think that is the fundamental problem. But this expo would definitely help incrementally reducing U.S. exports, increasing exports and reduce trade deficits with China at least. I think that's a very important incremental step.
But the other thing is, Mr. Moon, whether the U.S. economies and the businesses are going to be competitive enough against all the other around the world who also want to have a share of the Chinese market, isn't it?
Well, I think U.S. businesses are competitive. They are all around the world. The question really is not the U.S. structural deficit. The question is not tariffs. What the current trade dispute is all about is restoring equality and mutual benefit to the trade relationship. And that's something Chinese people understand, because equality and mutual benefit underscores all of China's relations with foreign countries. And that's when you look at the USTR complaint, talking about ownership restrictions, IPR problems, procurement problems. There are a variety of structural impediments, non-tariff barriers that China imposes, and if it were to remove those, and hopefully in the context of this this fair, if China really wants to do something significant in the context of this expo, it should take steps to reform and open up that also remove barriers to foreign competition.
China did said that already, right? But on the other hand, Mr. Moon, I want to remind you, it is your president, the President of the United States, suggesting in his Twitter and also through various occasions, official ones, that tariffs is the thing. You said tariffs is not the thing. He is saying tariff is the thing, and unfortunately, he is the President of the United States. Professor Gong, let me come back to you and respond to your colleague.
Well, I mean, I think certainly China is changing, and some of the things mentioned in that Section 301 report is something that Chinese government is already addressing. For example, we don't have a so-called positive list of things that we can only invest. Now we have a negative list, the things that you cannot invest. For example, defense industry, some other industries that usually foreign investments are not allowed to get into. Other than that, everything is open. So I think, gradually, and also sort of in a phased approach that the Chinese government is actually indeed addressing these structural issues. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump mentioned a couple of things. For example, intellectual property right protection. I think this is no disagreement here. Now, our government said very clearly. As a matter of fact, Premier Li Keqiang was in Europe a few days ago. He said very clearly that we are going to penalize those companies who steal intellectual property rights.
Okay.
And also from the Chinese government's perspective, our position on IPR is gradually shifting from more of a licensee position to a licensor position, because corporate China is changing in that direction. I'll give you one example.
Okay. We are running out of time, Mr. Gong, for this part. Final words from you before we wrap it up to Mr. Moon.
I think the issues that Donald Trump is raising, the United States government is raising, some of these things are already being addressed or are going to be addressed by the Chinese government. So I think that using these issues as an excuse for waging a trade war is just climbing the wrong tree.
All right. Mr. Moon, one final point from me before we go to you, that is, we want to remind people, this Import Expo has been committed to China, by China rather, much before there is the, shall we say, the taking place of the trade war between China and the United States. So, Mr. Moon, your final point for this part.
Well, that's why it does reflect openness on the Chinese part, and that's why it's all the more important in the context of the trade war for China to take concrete, important steps that it can announce at the Expo that will make a real difference for importers into China.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you. Stay with us. Our discussion is going to continue. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, our countdown to the China International Import Expo. We see how it sizes up against the century-old Canton Fair. Among the many trade platforms in China, the oldest, largest, and the most representative is the China Import and Export Fair. It is a trade fair held biannually every spring and autumn since the spring of 1957 in Guangzhou. It is co-hosted by the Ministry of Commerce from China and the government of Guangzhou and organized by the China Foreign Trade Center. The fair focuses on export trade, though import business is also done here. Apart from import and exports, the fair also covers business activities ranging from commodity inspection, insurance, transportation, advertising, and trade consultation. For more on the reforms that led to the China International Import Expo, we are joined in our Beijing studio. Zhang Gong, once again professor from the University of International Business and Economics. And meanwhile, we are also joined from India, Dr. Romi Jain, Vice President of the Indian Journal of Asian Affairs. I want to welcome both of you. Even though I wish the light in your place could be much brighter, Ms. Jane, but it's certainly, Dr. Jane, good to see you. Help us to understand your understanding about the Canton Fair for China, which has been going on for more than 60 years, and now there's this Import Expo. How should we see the evolution of the Chinese economy through these two very different events?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When you see, in contrast to the Canton Fair, China International Import Expo is the first national expo which is import-centric. Because Canton Fair has focused on stabilizing export transactions. Last time when it took place, the number of overseas buyers went up. And according to Canton Fair organizers, well, it was an objective to showcase competitiveness of Chinese companies and Chinese brands and China's smart manufacturing power. And for example, their ability to produce low carbon green content. So it was to showcase Chinese competence, economic competence to buyers, overseas buyers.
I see.
That was the focus. Yes, but the focus of CIIE, that is Import Expo, is important. It is to allow others, giving others an opportunity to come to China to showcase what products they would like to sell. So I think that's spectacular and such a breakthrough in, I would say, in the history of Chinese economy to organize an event of such high magnitude, great magnitude.
Yeah. Professor Gong, though, earlier you mentioned about small and medium-sized enterprises might be benefiting from this specific Import Expo. But besides that, what about the different kinds of economies, developing countries, the emerging economies, or developed ones when it comes to their opportunities here at this Import Expo?
Well, I think that our door is open. I mean, China is open for business. Every economy, every country's exporters are welcome here, as long as they have a good product, they have a convincing product that can sell on the Chinese market. We don't have a sort of discriminatory policy against a particular country. And of course, our biggest trade surplus is with the United States, and we like to alleviate that problem and hope for that more American companies will come to China and sell their stuff here. But in the grand scheme of things, I think that China is increasingly becoming the United States to China in the 1980s and 1990s. We are becoming a destination of world's exporters. We are running a very large trade surplus overall, and that we would like to mitigate that trade surplus, be a more balanced and reciprocal trade. So I think that our business is, China is open for business for everyone, and every company from every country is welcome here in Shanghai.
But here's the thing, Professor, is there going to be a preference policy against certain countries, let's just say the United States, because of the trade war, therefore China would give them more opportunities, or it is going to be a level playing field?
Well, I think from the Expo's organizer's perspective, it's going to be a level playing field. I mean, every company is going to be, as long as they pay a very moderate due to set up a booth there, everyone is welcome. I mean, from their perspective, they would like to have the Expo as large as possible. So every company is more than welcome to set up a booth there and exhibit their great product here.
Ms. Jane, of course, Dr. Jane, India could be one of those participating in the event. China and India both are BRICS nations and also emerging economies. What could be the thing coming to your mind about India can bring to the Import Expo?
Yeah, I think that Import Expo would provide great opportunity for Indian companies to showcase their products, whether it be textile or whether it be, I would say, medicine, pharmaceuticals, and also I would say services sector, which India is very strong in services sector. So that's key sectors that come to my mind, and I think that's indeed a great opportunity.
Professor Gong, if I ask you the question, what does it mean? Earlier we had this Canton Fair, 1957. Think about that. China was a planned economy, and there was a Cold War. And now this Import Expo, probably one of the very first in the world. How do you see this evolution and transformation Chinese economy has gone through so far?
This is probably one of the biggest success stories of human economic development. Now keep in mind that this Canton Fair was actually an exports fair. It had a very humble beginning, in the 1960s, a long time ago, in the 1970s. And starting from that very humble beginning, it has blossomed into a gigantic exposition, if not one of the largest exhibitions in the world. We have a lot of exhibitors from China's exporters as well as foreign exporters into China. And now we have particularly going to set up an exhibition for imports alone. So the exhibition itself, the history of the exhibition itself, testifies to the success of the China economic growth model. Testifies to the fact that we have grown from a sort of a dirt poor, a Soviet-style planned economy into a more prosperous, with a very large middle class and a relatively decent lifestyle kind of economy in the world. We are more affluent, much more affluent than we were in the 1960s and 1970s.
Of course, that is just a fact. Zhang Gong and Romy Jane, thank you so much for being with us. Professor Gong, you want to stay with us for the latter half of our discussion. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come. With companies from over 130 countries, especially from Africa, committing to the China International Import Expo, can this prove to be President Xi Jinping's latest tool for the Belt and Road Initiative? We'll be back after this. Welcome back. At last spring's Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, President Xi Jinping announced that starting from 2018, China would host the China International Import Expo. From last May to now, the expo has ranked high on the leadership's agenda. This Wednesday, while addressing the BRICS Business Forum, Chinese President Xi Jinping also said that China International Import Expo will serve as a new platform for the world to access the Chinese market.
今年11月
China will host the first China International Import Expo in Shanghai this November, a major move to firmly support trade liberalization and open its market.
主动向世界开放市场的重大举措，将为各方
The expo will serve as a new platform for the world to access the Chinese market. By now, over 130 countries and regions and more than 2,800 companies have confirmed participation.
参加博览会。
For more on the China International Import Expo as a form of hard power or soft power, we are joined in our Beijing studio once again. Zhang Gong, thank you and welcome back. Ian Beck in London, professor at the European Institute and also co-director of the Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Last but not least, in Washington, D.C., we welcome back Jeff Moon, former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have all of you. Let me go to you, Professor Beck, since you are joining us anew. What about that? Will this the first ever import expo a country has ever held be able to change or streamline the current debate about how trade should be done in the world?
Well, yes, I think the important political impact of the expo will be to signal that China is open to consume imports from the rest of the world. And that's a very important consideration, given your earlier discussion about the very large Chinese trade surplus and the concern, particularly in Washington, that China has been too ready to adopt what we call mercantilist policies of exporting but not importing. So anything that changes that rhetoric and says, yes, China is going to buy from the rest of the world, and to aim towards greater balance is going to be very constructive in international trade relations, as well as, let's face it, good for Chinese consumers.
Right. It is good for Chinese consumers if competitive products are the final result that are coming into the Chinese market. Professor Gong, Professor Begg raised an interesting issue. He's using the word mercantilism. That, of course, has been a word some have been using to describe China, while China disagree about the nature of it. What do you say about this perception? Meanwhile, will this so-called Import Expo be able to change some of the minds in the world?
Well, I think it's a mercantilist approach is a gross exaggeration. Now, we have to keep in mind that it's true that China exports definitely exceeds imports by a large margin. But look at the exports composition. 40% of it is actually originated from multinational companies operating in China. Let's face the fact. China is the world's manufacturing factory. We have so many multinational companies setting up shops here in China, manufacture things and export around the world. So it's not really we Chinese exporting. It's companies from around the world, American companies, European companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies. They all set up companies here in China and export to the world. But granted that we still have a very large trade surplus. It's an issue that we have to resolve. But we have to put that surplus into context. Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Mr. Moon, do you think people know that very well back in the United States? And will this Import Expo be able to help people to get to know better and more sophisticated about exactly what is the nature of this issue?
Well, I would differ with Professor Gong. You can look at the annual reports of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Beijing and the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, and they list in great detail mercantilist policies that prevent exports into China and encourage China to export to other countries. So this is a long-standing problem. This is the root of the trade dispute, of the current trade dispute. And I think anything that can clarify that would be all for the better. And if China uses this expo to roll out concrete policies that would address this issue, I think it would be a great contribution. Right now, we're in the realm of soft power, where China is making announcements about what it might do. Hard power consists of actual facts on the ground. And so if China wants to use this as a hard power device or event, then it needs to make big changes. Suppose, for example, China announced that it wants to open its market as much as the U.S. market is open to China. That's a reasonable policy. That would be a reasonable change. That would be something that would really shake up the world. People would take notice, and people would take China's statements about reform and opening up very seriously.
Very interesting, Mr. Moon. You mentioned that. I'm just wondering, are you referring to also the Chinese side should announce $200 billion tariffs against the American goods, $500 billion against American goods? I hope not. But anyway, let me go to Professor Gong to respond to your American colleague.
Well, I mean, I certainly can understand the perspective from the American Chamber of Commerce here in China and European Chamber of Commerce here in China. But in terms of the trade policies itself, I think we are doing here mostly adhere to what what China as promised when it was accepted to WTO 17 years ago. I mean, look at statements after statements from Pascal Lamy, the ex-secretary of WTO. He says very clearly that China more or less has adhered to the policies that we have committed to when we joined WTO. And also, the USTR's office itself, it issues a China's compliance, WTO compliance report every year. And year after year, they've been saying positive things about China. Only the report last year, I think the USTR report under this gentleman's administration probably still have a quite positive note in that report about China's compliance with WTO. So I think we shouldn't hold China accountable by today's standard. We should really look at the standard set when China joined WTO 17 years ago. And of course, things have changed, and we can negotiate. We can talk about things in that way.
Well, Professor Begg, what about that point made by Professor Gong about China has been this manufacturing hub of the world, and therefore many of the things counted as Chinese exports to the other countries, whether to European countries or to the United States, actually are those produced by multinationals in China. And also, if you look at the production line, many of the components and the devices used in those final products also imported by China from the other countries as well. So there is a fundamental flaw in the overall how surplus is being counted when it comes to China's version with the others. Professor Begg.
You know the answer I'm going to give you now, yes and no. Much of what Professor Gong says is correct. There are these supply chains and networks which mean that what's imported is then re-exported. But there are two other considerations. One is what is the overall macroeconomic position on this, and that remains that value added in China through adding to the components that come in is generating a trade surplus. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But maybe much more important is how it's politically perceived in other parts of the world. In particular, Washington, who see repeatedly China having a trade surplus. They say this is China trying to undermine us, and that translates into the Trump political agenda, which is saying China is taking American jobs. Now, all of us around in this panel will probably agree that that's such a simplistic way of analysing it that it doesn't make sense. But it is a political phenomenon that has to be examined and dealt with.
No, I disagree with Mr. Beck's first point. I mean, the customs duty, the customs data we are seeing today doesn't reflect value added created in a particular country. I mean, this is really an issue that is we economists in the international economics community trying to address. The data we are seeing here.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So we have actually no idea about, very little idea to say about the actual surplus if we're talking about value added created in China. That's an issue that we're still looking into.
So nobody is having that data so far. Nobody's having concrete data in the hand.
Well, WID, there is a WID data here created by, I think it's cooperation work between OECD and WTO, and I think World Bank is also involved.
So your point is, Professor Gong?
My point is that this, they have some, well, it's actually a complicated issue. I mean, they have some input-output national data and trying to work from that data to work out the value added crossing national borders.
Professor Gong, you have to translate your very technical sounding explanation into plain language, because we do want to have our audience understand this very important point. This is an important point. Right. It is because it's complicated, and therefore it is not being mentioned in the media a lot in the West. It is not being articulated by the Western politicians either. It is certainly has been an arguing point coming from the other two gentlemen in this debate, and therefore, Professor Gong, can you explain in the language that everybody could understand to tell us exactly what China meant and means?
Okay, so each country has an input-output data table. That means that it looks at the, the data for input data as well as output data. And the WID project is a project between several international organizations trying to use that input-output table for each country. And they have like 100-some countries, and combine this data to come up with a better understanding of value added getting across national borders between countries. But this is actually at a very high level. It doesn't, correspond very well to the customs data. Customs data, they have probably something like over 2,000 subcategories, but this is only 36 subsectors. So it's actually very aggregate data. But the point I'm trying to make is that even from this exercise, no matter how you look at it, is the outcome of this is going to be much smaller than the real, the trade deficit we're seeing from the customs bill, which is something like $375 billion that the United States government is claiming.
Professor Begg, you want to respond?
Yes, I think there may be a much simpler way of looking at it is who gets the work. That's where the surplus is generated. If one country is getting the work and the other country is paying for the work, then that is a surplus accruing to the country where the work takes place.
But it's much more complicated than that, isn't it, Professor? If I could just include your answer, because it is not just national border we're talking about. Multinational companies are everywhere. They're in Europe. And they are doing things for the European market and also for the international market. They're here in China as well. So, Professor Beck, can we simplify as that, Professor?
Well, I think you can get a long way by examining where the work takes place, and that tells you the bulk of the value added. Now, there are, of course, profit flows that counter that, because if a multinational company invests in China, makes a profit, and then takes the profit out of China, that diminishes the added value that, or the benefit that China gets from that. And this is equally the case in a country like Ireland, which always tells the rest of the European Union, we make a lot, but we don't benefit from it.
Right. It's a very interesting point. I think I have to say we have to pause here about this debate, because this could be very technical. We could go like 1 or 2 hours, because nobody in the world even figure out an answer about that. But it does not mean that there is a not as complicated issue as we have just mentioned. People should bear in mind it's complicated. It's not just like black and white and saying one country is having huge amount of surplus against the other country without counting in these complicated matters. Having said that, though, let me come back to you, Mr. Moon. You said something very important about the power. This is the power of showing commitment. It's not the power of so-called soft power or the hard power, but the power of showing commitment to the words that one wants to follow with actions, Mr. Moon. This time, it's about China. But what about the United States when it comes to the fair trade? Will tariff lead the way for fair trade?
No, because this tariff war is not about tariffs. It's about ownership restrictions. It's about key sectors that aren't open to foreign companies. It's about industrial policy. Those are the real issues. Tariffs are just a tool that the Trump administration is using to try to get changes in those areas. And the reason they're using this tool is that decades of talks have gotten nowhere and getting reform, and many of the problems that are addressed fall into loopholes in the WTO. So we need reform of the WTO as well. So this is not the end. Tariffs are not the end of the administration. They're the only tool that they have.
Mr. Begg, is it also the way that how United States is interacting with the European Union or the European countries? It's not about the tariffs? I thought the Brussels was pretty much angry about it is all about the tariffs.
Yes, I fully agree with what's just been said by Mr. Moore, that this is an instrument that's being used to change the nature of the political deal-making. And maybe a different expression that could be more helpful in this is that what both the Americans are demanding, and to some extent the Europeans are beginning to offer, is a level playing field, where if the playing field is level, everybody is able to compete on equivalent terms. And the allegation, and I stress allegation, because I don't want to provoke Professor Gong any further, made against China is that it tilts the playing field away from level in its favor.
But what about steel and aluminum coming from the EU countries toward the U.S. market? That was also, in a way, suggested with the U.S. reaction about the tariffs. And of course, there is an apparent press release coming from the EU together with the United States about what's the next step to do, but it's certainly not a deal at all. Mr. Bagga.
Well, I think it's a de-escalation of what was turning into a rather counterproductive trade war. And the music I hear from what happened in Washington between Jean-Claude Juncker and Trump is that they saw eye to eye on the necessity of de-escalating.
Right.
They're therefore going to keep some of the threats in the background, but avoid having more direct imposition of tariffs that will cause a trade war that nobody wants.
Okay. Before we go, of course, Professor Gong, I have to let you to answer that final question. Well, I mean, from now until the import expo happens, still 100 days to go. It's more than 3 months, so a lot of things could happen about the trade situation. How is it likely to be complicating the potential of this import expo from you, Professor Gong?
I think we are razor focused on opening this expo. We are razor focused on inviting business around the world to come to Shanghai. It's a great city. By the way, it's my hometown. It's a beautiful city, and everyone should come and put their products on display and let Chinese consumers make their choice. But back to your point, I think I totally concur that Mr. Moon has raised that there are structural issues related to industrial policies that are very much subject to debate, subject to negotiation, subject to
very
change.
briefly, sir.
But definitely tariff is not the way to do it. It's counterproductive. It's destructive.
Okay.
There's nobody good.
John Gong, Ian Beck, Jeff Moon. Obviously, we have different views, gentlemen, but for now, thank you so much for joining us. We hope the Import Expo will be a great success. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night. Thank you, sir.